Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Mina. I'm the head librarian here at the Charleston Library Society. I have my phone up here as a reminder for you to bring up your phones and to turn your ringers to silent. And also, I just want to welcome you. We are in our 275th year as an institution, which gives us a little bit of credit for why a program like this makes so much sense for us. This year is filled with celebrations. This week we are actually featuring an open house week. So we've been working with volunteers, but also staff is at the ready to take people around the room and to teach pretty much anybody that comes through the doors about Charleston Library Society's history. So before I start today, I just want to point out this case on this upper left-hand corner where you're going to see the portrait of Lushington that is discussed, and it's also set in the context of the 18th century and Charleston Library Society history, and it really kind of creates the relevance of why this portrait is here. So if you haven't read the captions and everything in the case yet, or seen the case, I encourage you after this talk to take some time to look at that, and then of course look at the rest of the exhibits here. So reading back through my correspondence with George McDaniel, I had written him an email where I said, "What a great way to start the day," which is pretty much what I'm saying about this morning's program. I had written this in response to a conversation that Lisa Hayes, our special collections librarian, and I had with George when he shared his discovery of Colonel Richard Lushington's portrait and his plans for how to share the news of its discovery with the world. And of course, we're to display it here. Indeed, it was a great way to start the day. I'll of course let him tell you that story as it's his to tell, excitement and all, but hopefully you can sense mine too. George McDaniel is a historian for South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust, my apologies, a role through which he is deeply immersed in the research and development of the Charleston Liberty Trail and an associated application, which I think you'll be able to download on your phones. He received his BA in history from Davidson College and an MA at the Center of the Study, MA for the study of Southern culture at the University of Mississippi. In the audience this morning are our honored guests, Beth and Faye Adams. Thank you for being here. Beth, having generously facilitated the gifting of her family's Lushington miniature to the Charleston Library Society, is, by all means, a reason to come together. Lushington returning to the Library Society in portrait form is very much like a homecoming. He was a member of the Charleston Library Society along with many other revolutionaries of the time, Christopher Gadsden, Alexander Moultrie, David Ramsey, Arthur Middleton, and the like, who also, as it would happen, were arrested and held together in exile from 1780 to 1781. They were connected intellectually at this cultural epicenter, then, just as we are today. Lushington was a Quaker and was the commanding officer of the Jews Company, or the Company of Free Citizens. That is also a story unto itself, that Ashley Walters, assistant professor of Jewish studies at the College of Charleston and director of the Palestine, Lipov Center for Jewish Studies, Southern Jewish Culture, will help us unpack in today's talk. We are so lucky to have her joining us today, especially since we are sort of taking her away from class. So thank you. A key takeaway from today's talk is that of the importance of the research of historians, people dedicated to their studies and craft who bring to light critical elements of history too often lost to the sands of time. Thank you, George and Ashley, for the work you do to dig up these stories and place them beautifully in context. We look forward to hearing all that you have to say.
Good morning. First, before I begin, I just want to recognize Beth Adams and Faye McDaniel, who are joining us today and who so generously donated this miniature to the Library Society. And as we'll see, it is really sort of a homecoming for Richard Lushington. So, Lushington Lost and Found is the title of this presentation today. And we're going to unpack sort of why he was lost, what we mean by that, and then also how he was been found both in the historical record, and we're telling the story, and then also literally found the portrait. So to begin, we start in 1790. Lushington, this is the obituary that was written on June 23rd. So, he died on Monday, and it says, on Monday last, the Honorable Richard Lushington, Lieutenant Colonel, Commandant of the Charleston Regiment of Militia, the many and meritorious services that he has rendered his country must ever claim its gratitude and the respectful veneration of his memory. So we see that in 1790, he was a very important figure, and calls for remembering who he was were made. However, he was forgotten. And part of that is, we're going to talk about is due to who he was as a Quaker and what happened to the Quakers in Charleston, and then through the years. So, starting at the beginning, he was born in 1751 in Charlestown. So Charlestown becomes Charleston following the Revolution. I'll try and keep them straight, but just so that if I mix them up, you know that. This is a famous etching done that shows Charlestown in 1762. And it shows Charlestown as this port city. This would have been the Charleston that he would have known as a young man. And Charleston was a real jewel in the British Empire and was a major port. In fact, it was rivaling New York, Boston, Philadelphia in terms of importance as a port in the colonies. Here we see a map from 1711, and we're talking, Richard Lushington, as Laura mentioned, was a Quaker. And we can see here, this is the old walled city around, and sort of from this would be the Cooper River down here, and then up to sort of Meeting Street is where that upper wall sort of ran. And then outside, we have the Quaker Meeting House. Which would ultimately be located along King Street. This was before King Street. But Quakers were sort of an outside group. Even though they were among the first settlers to come to the colony. And we have John Archdale, who was a governor in 1695 to 1696, was a Quaker. But they were a small group, and they were sort of outside. And here we have, not only are they outside sort of socially, but they are physically located outside of the walls of the city. And so that would play into sort of part of what I think defined Richard Lushington and his quest in his life. So he was a merchant, a prominent merchant, and was, not surprisingly, being a Quaker, was closely tied to Philadelphia. Of course, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, William Penn, Quakers, and that such. And so a lot of the advertisements that we see for his mercantile business are dealing with ships arriving from Philadelphia. And so all merchants had a very close-knit network that they would have utilized that was quite large, and expanded covered throughout the British Empire. But it's Lushington sold these flour and various sundry goods, and we know where he lived, which is We'll find out back to this mercantile. In 1774, Richard Lushington marries Charity Ball. She, as we have here, this is the marriage announcement from July 8, 1774. He marries what was Charity Ball, Ball, who was noted as being the widow of William Ball. William Ball, I would believe, of the Ball family in South Carolina, the slaves in the family, all of that. So she is of a prominent family, and so this sort of shows Lushington's ascendancy in Charleston society. He is, even though he's a Quaker and sort of this small minority, he is working towards gaining acceptance into the elite Charleston society that he wants to be a part of. And his marriage to Charity is just part of that evidence that he's marrying this woman who was of this very prominent family. It shows that he's sort of on this ascendant track. So this is, we now know where he lived. This is an advertisement in 1774, just a few days after the marriage announcement, announcing 8 lots on the Hazel Street, which is a new street. And we don't know whether it was this advertisement that attracted Lushington's attention, but we do know that he purchased land on Hazel Street because we have tax records, and with those tax records we know that he ran a distillery, and with that we can then go down. This is a 1790 map, Phoenix fire map, and with the description from tax records of the land and that he had a distillery, we can then place his distillery, labeled by the V in the circle here, and that's right there across from the Harris Teeter on East Bay Street. Right there, that's Harris Teeter Street, Hazel Street, coming into East Bay Street. And the little alleyway behind it is still there, and there's still homes there. Unfortunately, we don't have, all of the buildings are lost because fires were a major issue there. Charleston had many fires, and the Great Fire of 1838 destroyed pretty much this entire Anson Borough district. So now there are beautiful historic homes located right where he would have been, but those homes are all built in 1842. And so they're beautiful and historic, but they aren't of the 18th century. And but we do know exactly where he was located, which is fantastic. And again, showing, because of that proximity to the wharfs, as you can see, his prominence as a merchant, because the land, the closer you get to the water, the higher the price goes for land. And the same goes today. Waterfront property is a lot more expensive than inland, although in Charleston, maybe not. I guess it's all relative. But because he's so close, we know that's an indicator of his prominence and stature, growing stature. So the Revolutionary War breaks out, and Richard Lushington starts, or is assigned a captain to a militia unit. And in the Revolutionary War, you mustered with militia by your residential address. And just quickly, there's Continentals, which are the regular American Army, that's Washington and all that. And then there are all these militias that start up throughout, all around the colonies. Charleston had a militia, which is, and this company that Richard Lushington was the commanding officer of, was part of the Charlestown militia. And this is from Barnett Elsass, who did a groundbreaking book back in the early 20th century of the Jews of South Carolina. And he describes Richard Lushington's district as running from Boundary Street, Calhoun, all the way down King Street, right past where we are right now, down to Broad Street. And much like King Street is today, King Street then was mercantile, and there were a lot, and we still, it would have been having a shop on the street level and then living above, and so you mustered by your residential address, so therefore he gets lots of these merchants, and most of them are a significant portion of his militia unit is made up of Jewish merchants from that area. And so they go off, they are engaged in some fighting. The Battle of Port Royal Island in 1779, then the Siege of Savannah, also in later that year in 1779, and the big one, the Siege of Charlestown, which actually some dates or sources have the date starting as March 29th as one of the first sort of engagements. So today, and so they're engaged in these battles, and the Siege of Charlestown is going to play a really important role in what we're going to unpack a little bit later with Ashley. But it's one of the largest, is the largest loss of American soldiers to surrender up until World War II and Bataan in the Philippines. And it's a massive, massive loss. But they were fighting in it. So after Lushington serves in the military, the Revolutionary War is over, he continues to serve. And this also, again, shows his ascendancy into Charleston society. He's a member of the General Assembly from 1780 to 1790, so he's a prominent legislator. He's a city warden, so like a city councilman for his district down there in that Ansonboro area. He's a member of the Fellowship Society, the South Carolina Society, and also in 1780, right before the city falls, is accepted into the Library Society, which you can see they have it highlighted in the cabinet over there. Turn to the page where his acceptance is read into the minutes, and it's right before the chasm, because shortly thereafter, Charleston falls and Charleston Library Society is stopped for a period of time. But this all just shows as he's trying to ascend and gaining acceptance into this world of the elite Charleston society. So his last will, and this is part of why he's lost. He was, as we said, he's a Quaker, and then his Quakers have very different burial rites than we do. And I'm an Episcopalian, and others. There's often no tombstones, and even in his will, he specifically states that he is to be buried without ceremony. And the Quaker cemetery was located right down the street, about half a block from here, where the big Charleston County parking garage is located today. So literally paved over paradise and put up a parking lot, right? So they did. So Quakers are sort of erased from the physical landscape of Charleston. They had vanished, or had largely vanished by the late 18th century, and then in the early 19th century, they ultimately, those that were left, leave, because Charleston then becomes much more sort of bifurcated and over slavery. And Quakers, by the early 19th century, had really hardened on their anti-slavery position, and so any remnants of Quakers in Charlestown, in the Charleston meeting, disappeared. The Quaker meeting house did stand until 1838, and then was razed. Actually, it's said to be dynamited during the fire to eliminate it, so that as part of sort of fire break. So in 1969, crews relocated the remains that were the remains that they found that were in the land where the Quaker cemetery was, and they relocated them to this small little courtyard right behind the county courthouse at Broad, meaning the four corners of law, right across from where the South Carolina Historical Society building, the fireproof building, and all that is. And they put up a little marker, as you can see, and the one tombstone that was extant in the cemetery, they did move, and that happens to be Richard Lushington's brother-in-law. He was married, Daniel Latham is his name, he was married to Charity's sister. So here's the Quaker burial ground. It lists some of the names. The Quaker records, they would record whenever someone was buried. And unfortunately, the Lushington dies in a period where they're not recording. And that's because the Quaker movement is falling apart. So the records go until about 1775, and then of course with the war breaking out, there's a bit of breakup in that, and then they began again in the late 1790s. But look, Richard Lushington is not among those listed, and not because I believe that he was buried there. He was born here, lived here, fought here, died here. He must have been buried there, but it just is unfortunately not in the historic record that we found yet, so we can't definitively say it. But all circumstantial evidence points to that. This is what it is today, the beautiful brutalist, our Charleston County parking garage, and there is a small little plaque that was put up there. A small little section of the cemetery that was not covered. In 1967, there was a future, the Preservation Society had plans to turn it into a park. And in fact, they had, it's tough to read here, but Latrell Briggs, the famous landscape architect, designed this little sketch of what the park would have looked like. Unfortunately, the city of Charleston, county of Charleston, I should say, parking was of too much of an import, and so they moved ahead and turned it into a parking lot. So, quickly, these are from 1936, these black and white photographs. It was an exhibit by the Gibbes Museum on miniatures that they held on famous South Carolinians and then South Carolinians in other places. And the little clue here, the only clue that I had as to where these things were, was lent by the Misses Oemler of Savannah. So put on my detective hat and go to work tracking down Oemlers in Savannah, and go through the process, and we'll talk to Ashley a little bit about this, but go through and run into a lot of dead ends, but find out eventually that the Misses Oemler were these two sisters who lived on Wilmington Island, which is right outside of Savannah. And so Google and Facebook lead me to the Facebook group, The History of Wilmington Island, Georgia. And I created a long post explaining who I was, what I was doing, and had the photographs. And within about 15 minutes, a woman named Elizabeth Adams replied to the post and said, "I have them, sent you an email." And so I could not get to my phone fast enough. So this is, contacted her, and she was gracious enough to invite me down to come see them. This is me photographing taking the picture, photographing the miniatures. The first time they photographed in color, and been seen outside of the Adams house in almost 90 years. So here's on the left is Phelan's McDaniel and Beth Adams, sisters, whose great aunts were the Misses Oemler of Savannah. And then on the right is me with Beth, of course, and the Lushington portrait that she so generously donated. And here are the photographs that I took that have been, you may have seen in the paper and such, but for the first time, and now they are here and truly sitting right over there, but you can see them. This is my CEO, the CEO of South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust, Doug Bostick, Laura Minor, who you just met, and myself on the day of the arrival of the miniatures here to Charleston Library Society as we were welcoming home. And then here it is again. You can see, and you can see this all for yourself right now over there in the cabinet. But with the page of him being admitted into the Library Society. So welcome home, Richard Lushington. And with that, I'm going to invite my friend and colleague Ashley Walters up to join me for a little conversation about revolutionary Charlestown and what all this work means. So.
Hi everyone. Is this working? Yeah, you can hear me? All right. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful, and I really appreciate you inviting me to join you on stage here to talk about Lushington. This has been an ongoing conversation for a while now. So I thought, I think the order of things is that we are going to chit-chat for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. I want to make sure that anyone in the audience who has questions gets a chance to ask them. But I think a good place to start is thinking about the fact that you and your work on Lushington, me and my work on Jews in Charleston, both can deal with these religious minority groups, and thinking about what is at stake for religious minorities when it comes to the revolution and fighting, participating in militaries. And so I'd be curious to hear you talk about what you think was at stake for Lushington in assuming the role that he did in the revolution, whether it was similar for Quakers and Jews, and ultimately what you would have been thinking about.
Yeah, so again, this goes back to that idea of him being an outsider. He is a Quaker. He's of Charleston. He's born in Charleston, grows up in Charleston, and is a prominent merchant. But he's also not of the Anglican dominating society. And Anglicans, truly did dominate. And so he was of this minority. And there is, and just in fighting, and we sort of think about military today is very different than then. As I said, there was the Continental Army, but then there were these militias that were just sprung up in cities and towns, and the officers, it was sort of like a social, a way to climb the social ladder by serving. And the titles and ranks were sort of given as a social contract kind of thing. And so he starts off as a captain and works his way up. So I think it is a part of becoming of the society, and then also Quakers. Particularly, were pacifists and had been pacifists, and so it was, a definite choice for him to take up arms. But I can see, if you look back to the Yenisei War, which is in 1715, in that range, there had been a backlash against Quakers because they had been pacifists many of them had been pacifists during that war, and so were then seen as even further ostracized them from the society of Charleston. So I can see how he would see this past tension and this backlash, and think of taking this as an opportunity to take up arms and to sort of firmly establish himself. Unfortunately, we don't have any journals, and so we don't know exactly what his mindset was. But I think for both he as a Quaker and then also the Jewish men in his militia unit, it was an opportunity to further establish themselves and to fight for for freedom from England And so, yeah. So.
Just as kind of a follow-up, so do you think it's fair to say that the Jewish merchants who fought in Lushington's militia would have been more well integrated as merchants on King Street than, say, a Quaker in Charleston?
I think it.
Microphone, please. We can't hear you.
Okay.
I think you need to move it together.
Can you hear me now?
No.
I don't see any light. So.
Stick with us.
Well, I can repeat the question. And so she was asking if the Jewish men who fought in Lushington's militia were more well integrated into Charleston society than Lushington himself. And I think it depends on who you're talking about. With all things like history, it's kind of complicated. There were those men like there's Isaac DaCosta and the DaCosta cemeteries, the Cumming Street Cemetery, which is the Hal Kadash Beth Elohim cemetery, located right over on Cumming Street, and that was DaCosta land. We have records in the Charleston Library Society that DaCostas were members of the Library Society well before Lushington became a member, and so there were those, I think, who were more well integrated, but by and large, the men who would have served under Lushington were, as we said, the titles, the ranks were given out as sort of social pieces, and so they were privates, so they were not of that status to gain the rank of that. However, that being said, Lushington's second in command, his sergeant major, was a man named Marks Lazarus, who is buried in the Cumming Street Cemetery. And so there were some prominent, and he would have, in order to get that rank, he would have been prominent. So it's kind of like with everything, that there are layers and levels to it. But we certainly think that the war, coming out of the war, Lushington is much more firmly established into the society, because that's when he joins the Library Society, the fellowship, and all these other things, and then is in the legislature and is a city councilman and every city warden and such. So is constantly on this ascendant track.
So something you shared with me when we were talking the other day that I did not know prior to our conversation was that there were actually 2 revolutionary militia units here in Charleston that had a sizable Jewish population. And so one was led by Richard Lushington, the other by James Bentham, who was an Anglican. Have you been able to learn anything about Bentham and his unit?
We know a little bit. Bentham is an interesting character. He is Anglican, so he is of the right group, right? But he is British. He's born in England, and then is sent as a young man, about 12 or 13 years old, to Charlestown as an apprentice. And so, and then he goes on, he is also a captain in the Revolutionary War. So you have these 2 gentlemen, one who is wholly of Charleston, born, raised, and fights with the Charlestown Regiment, but is an outsider because he's a Quaker. And then you have this other gentleman who is English, and not only, I guess, until the Revolution, all were English citizens technically, but is born in England and then comes over as a young man. And so he's sort of an outsider, that he's not of Charleston itself. He's not, he wouldn't be able to have the little native sticker going down 26 with a palmetto tree, whereas Lushington could. So there's that interesting sort of dynamic. And then they both go on and lead these units, which are primarily, significant portions are made up of Jewish merchants. But Bentham is buried in St. Philip's Cemetery. You can go visit his grave. He's right over there. Lushington was, probably buried and is either under the parking lot or was one of the ones that were moved. And unfortunately, because there were no tombstones and there was no way to identify who was moved. I think in the article it says they moved 15 or 16 remains, but so Bentham is still very much of the Charleston landscape, and Lushington has been kind of erased. So you have these interesting little dynamics going on. Yeah.
So as you're talking about your kind of this erasure that we see in understanding who Lushington was and whatnot, it makes me want to know more about your process, how you actually went about retrieving these names, connecting the different dots. Have you been able to identify certain businesses on King Street that were connected to the men who fought in Lushington's militia?
So we have some partial muster rolls. So we know the names of some of the men that fought under Lushington. Unfortunately, we don't have a complete muster roll. These are part of the challenges you're dealing with, documents and sources that are over 250 years old. And then also specifically in Charleston, you have all these fires that occurred, and so records and documents are lost. And so, but we do have a partial muster roll. As I said, we do know that Marks Lazarus, who was a Jewish man and is buried at Cumming Street Cemetery, we know that he was the sergeant major. We know, in fact, there in one of the slides I showing the battles, there's a report of Lushington's unit following the Battle of Port Royal Island, in which a gentleman named Solomon Abrams was killed. So we piece it together through those pieces. As far as the businesses on King Street, we know that they were here, but we can't. Unfortunately, we can't trace it back because what we found, and Doreen Lammer who's done some fantastic, deep researcher extraordinaire. What we found is that a lot of these men didn't own the land or own the property; they were leasing it, and so whereas we know Lushington owned the lot on Hazel Street, we can trace that back. Boom, here's the deed title, and we can go forward with it. But if they didn't own it, it becomes a lot more problematic in trying to say where they were. But we know that they were all here. That this was, this was where their stores were located, and it would be great if we could say, hey, if this was, here's where Marks Lazarus's business was. But unfortunately, we can't do that. And so it may be that we, think about, like, there's on Upper King Street, there's the Little Bethlehem historic marker, signifying where the Jewish merchants sort of moved in the late 19th and early 20th century. But we might be able to develop something like that, sort of recognition there. But as far as saying this is where it was, you can't do that. And another thing, we have, the almanacs, and here at Library Society, they have the city almanacs dating back to the 1776, I believe is the first one here. And if you look in those, they have an address. and it'll say, 42 King Street. But the problem is that 42 King Street in 1776 may be, 240 King Street today. There's no, you can't go, there's no correlation there. You have to have the deed and do chain of title, and that's just unfortunately not possible since they didn't own the land.
Just to shamelessly plug the work of some of my predecessors at the Pearlstein Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture, Dale Rosengarten, Sherry Rabin, Harlan Green has been really integral to this. We have a visual map of Charleston in which you can go to the year 1788 and actually take a tour of Charleston and get a sense of where these businesses were. But again, the exact locations unknown. It's really just a guess. But it's a really remarkable resource that they go on.
It is. It's called Mapping Jewish Charleston. Is the name of the thing, and they actually do have one gentleman who was Abraham Solomon. One of them is actually. He was prominent enough and was able to buy the land, and they've actually said exactly where he was located. But beyond that, a lot of these men, there's no way to track it. But yes, Mapping Jewish Charleston is a fantastic resource. Yeah, glad they play it.
So I kind of wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about one of the battles that Lushington and his company fought in, and that's the Siege of Charleston. It's particularly interesting, and so I wondered if you could share a bit about the siege, what Lushington might have been doing, and then ultimately what happens to Lushington.
So the Siege of Charleston begins, right about March 29th, and Henry Clinton decides that the British make this decision to sweep south and begin what's called the Southern Campaign, not Nixon's, 200 years later, and so that they capture Savannah, and then until they siege Charleston, because Charlestown was, as I said, it was a jewel in the British crown, and one thing that when we sort of think about Charlestown in the 18th century, it's important to remember that it's polyglot, and so there were it was really of the British Empire, and what so often people think of now when they think of Charleston as sort of a 19th century antebellum Charleston, and that's much more bifurcated, white and black, with slavery. But anyway, so Siege of Charleston, the British decided they were going to come to Charleston. Benjamin Lincoln, who was the commander of the Continental Southern Army, makes the decision that he and believes that the Continental Congress wants him to do this, that he is going to defend Charleston at all costs. And so this is where he's going to make his stand. And so he puts out a call to all country militia to come, and they have up here in Marion Square is what was called the Hornwork, which is the main defense line, and then sort of down on this end, sort of the old walled city area, you have there's still people, women, children, all still here. And you can imagine, Gabriel Manigo actually has a wonderful little line where he describes coming back from Europe and says, after spending 5 years over there, and comes back to Charleston and says he describes it as a state of great confusion. As you can imagine, I mean, I think we sometimes lose the perspective of just how wild it is that the continental United States stood up to Great Britain, which at that time was the most powerful empire on the face of the planet. And here you are, on this little peninsula, and as you look out, go down to the Battery and look out to the Atlantic Ocean, here comes the British Navy, which is the most powerful navy that has ever, sailed the seas, coming at you from that way. And then Clinton lands with the British Army over on Seabrook Island, what's known as Seabrook Island today, and then comes from Seabrook Island to Johns Island to James Island to West Ashley. They actually camp at Drayton Hall and then cross the Ashley River and come over to right where the Citadel is today, that Hampton Park. That's where the British lines were. And so you can imagine being in this city, and at your doorstep is the British Army and the British Navy, and how just frightening that must have been. And then it lasts for about 6 weeks in that neighborhood, and it's just relentless cannonading from the British, just firing from that Hampton Park and firing down, and then it's siege warfare. And the British, what they do is they build these trenches and begin moving closer and closer. It's horrifying, and Clinton holds on. He believes that he's writing to the Continental Congress and such to bring relief, and relief which never comes, and then ultimately there's a letter that's written to him that's signed by about 70 to 80 militia officers who were of the city of Charleston, who say, please, let's surrender. Let's surrender while we still have a city. And so Lincoln finally bends to that, and then of course the British occupy Charlestown for almost 2 years, but because they surrender, it's not completely destroyed, and so we still have many houses down all sort of south of here, on Tradd Street and Church Street and all that. There are extant homes that were there. In fact, there's one even that has supposedly a cannonball. You can trace the cannonball through the timbers of the home, and so it is said that Lincoln surrenders, and it's the largest surrender of American troops up until Bataan in World War II. It's a tremendous loss, and then also losing the port. But then a quick little story on Francis Marion, who changes the course. But there's the John Stewart House, which is right on the Tradd and I think Tradd and Orange. But there was before the siege begins, Francis Marion is at this party. The commanding officer locks the doors and begins a endless round of toasts and drinking. And Francis Marion is not a teetotaler, but does not like to drink so much. So he decides to make his escape, and rather than go out front and cause a scene, he leaps out of a second-story window, either fractures or severely sprains his ankle, and is carried out on a stretcher before the siege begins, and he goes to Santee, and so then he is around when Charleston falls. He's not among those who is surrendered, and then he is around to then to turn and harass the British throughout the backcountry and really change the war. So very Charleston that a party changes the tide of American history.
And so what happens to Lushington?
So Lushington is among those who surrenders, and he is arrested. The surrender occurs in May, and in August, he is arrested along with Christopher Gadsden, Alexander Moultrie, Edward Rutledge, Josiah Smith, who thankfully kept a diary of these events. So major figures in Charleston, they're arrested and are exiled to St. Augustine, Florida, which is at that time was under British control. And they are sent down there as prisoners of war. But there is this interesting sort of balance of, they were prisoners of war, but they also were allowed to rent villas. Some are allowed to bring their enslaved with them. So you've got this interesting dynamic of sort of a doubly enslaved person. They're someone who's enslaved, but then the person who's enslaving them is also a prisoner. And so, but they're allowed to rent villas, but he described one as a piazza that has an orange garden. And so, yes, they are exiled, and they are separated from their wives and children. But it's nothing like what we see on the prison ships, where it just is stacked almost like cordwood and disease and death and such. They are allowed to wander in a specific section of St. Augustine, but are allowed to wander and enjoy their piazzas and oranges and such. And the greatest insult is someone who's a loyalist that is in St. Augustine continues to send them pumpkins, and that apparently was a very big deal. A big insult was they kept receiving pumpkins, and so and they're there for about 8 or 9 months, and then there's a prisoner exchange, which is often how it would happen with the sort of men of that, sort of gentlemen, and so the exchange.
So I have so many more questions for you, but I've received the signal that I need to turn over the mic. So
Okay.
Now it's your turn if you have any questions for George.
Yes.
Could you please share how did Jews first come to Charlestown, and when, and under what circumstances, and from where?
Yeah. So again, that goes back to, so the question is, when did Jews first come to Charleston, and from where, and when? And they were among some of the first to come over. So in 1670, there's what's called the Foundational Constitutions, and it is fairly liberal for the time document, and it even has in the text that anyone, it is written by the British, and it's their colony, and that they will allow, anyone can come, be a Jew or heathen or what have you, essentially as long as you recognize a religion and recognize a supreme being, and let it be known what you are. Everything except Catholic. That's the only thing. Remember, Anglicans, so Protestant, Catholic, no. But so you get Jews from all over, Sephardic Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, from England, which again goes back to this idea of Charlestown in the 17th and 18th century really being polyglot. That you have all these languages that are being spoken. From Portuguese, Spanish, of course, you have enslaved being brought over from Africa. You have French Huguenots. You have so all of this sort of swirling, around in Charleston. But so the Jews were among some of the first to come over, and came from Europe, and came and then settled in the KKB, the Kahal Kadash Beth Elohim synagogue is established in mid 18th century, 1749. There we go. Yes. Yes.
Did the Jews come here first, or did they go to Savannah first and then come?
Did the Jews come here first?
First, or did they go to Savannah first, where there's a synagogue, and then come here?
I believe they came to the Charleston. Now the son might have gone to Savannah as well, but just Charleston, just the nature of Charleston being such a major port, would have been sort of the port of entry. And then the synagogue might not have been established until much later, but they were here. And then moved. But Charleston at the time was much larger and a much more prominent port of call than Savannah would have been.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have one comment and I have a question as well. The comment is, for those that might be interested, the Charleston Mercury had a series on the history of the Jewish folks in Charleston, maybe last year or 2 years ago, and it was over a series of several months. For anybody that's interested, might want to try to find that and look at it. It's very, very good. And my question is, Colonel Lushington, how did he rationalize abandoning his pacifist beliefs of the Quakers? I mean, we know what Nathaniel Green did, and so, but how did he rationalize that and become a fighter?
Well, the short answer is that we just don't know, because we don't have a journal where his thoughts, where he says, this is why I've done it. The Quakers, by the time of the Revolutionary War, the Quaker meeting was sort of, I don't know, dissolving. It had been a while. In 1750, there's a woman named Sophia Hume who was from Charleston and then goes to England and then comes back. She's a Quaker. And she writes a long letter that's called an exhortation to the Quakers in Carolina, because what she finds and what she believes is the Quakers in Charleston specifically have turned into sort of hedonistic. They are abandoning their Quaker faith. So we don't know what Lushington specifically is thinking, but what it's seeing, just sort of from the evidence and then sort of, drawing out, it would seem that he probably was more committed to being accepted into Charleston society than being, a devout Quaker. His Quaker beliefs, he was willing to sort of put that aside, and he was a Quaker in name, but was not the devout as many. And part of that, I think, is due to proximity to Philadelphia and that Pennsylvania, where there's a large concentration of Quakers there, and so they were sort of allowed to run themselves, and so the tightness, the regiment of being a strict pacifist was not. He was willing to sacrifice that, but again, we don't have a journal or diary or anything that specifically says that. Yes. He was. Yes.
By the way, Nathaniel Green was a Quaker too. It was a struggle for all of them.
Yeah.
And I have a comment, and I'm going to call it hidden in plain sight. Okay, wonderful history that you took from this one thing. But I was out at Magnolia with Fernanda Hastings. Anybody that knows Fernanda knew she was a curmudgeon. And you didn't argue with her, but she sure listened to you. But anyway, she gave me a tour of her house. And sitting on the piano was a small, whatever you call it, miniature portrait. And I looked at it a little bit. It was one of Fraser's portraits. Okay? She had no clue. And it was sitting right on the piano. You could get it just like that. And then later I went in her basement, and she had a 1780 Mac pinned to the wall with paper clips. And I can't remember which one it was, because this was 20 years ago or so. But the point being, we all have basements, we all have attics, and there's plenty more of these miniatures around. and you can run them down. And
Yep.
there's history to every one of them. It's a great lecture, I sure appreciate it.
Thank you, thank you. Yes?
Two questions. One, how did the Jews come to be segregated in two different regiments versus mixed around everybody else? Did people just go with friend groups tonight and that happened to be their friends?
I think, well, it has to do with the mustering by your residential address. And so, you know, there would have mercantile district, and so that they would have been like that. It wasn't that, oh, my friends are over here. It was you showed up, and then, you know, all right, you live here, so this is where you are.
And the mapping Jewish Charleston, is there a physical place where we can go to see that, or it's only online?
It's only online. So if you go to the Pearlstein Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture website, it's jewishsouth.cfc.edu. You can go under the virtual exhibits in the Mapping Jewish Charleston. It's there.
Well,
Okay, since I have the mic, I will take the liberty with the last question. So I'd love to hear about how you envision bringing Lushington to larger audiences and about your work on the Liberty Trail.
so, one thing that we're doing, with history, and history is in the news a lot right now, right? And so we're trying to get people to think about these things, and because Quakers and people like Lushington have largely been erased, and a lot of the 18th century buildings and landscape is gone simply because of fires and construction and all of that. So we are working on this Liberty Trail Act, which is for the whole state, that has Revolutionary War sites all around. And one thing I'm working on in particular, which is what led to sort of this discovery, is a Liberty Trail in Charleston. And one thing that we are doing is we are working, irony of ironies, with a British group to develop an augmented reality. And so Liberty Trail, you can download this on your phones, any app store, you can download it, and it'll have the map of South Carolina and write-ups on various sites across the state. But in Charleston, and there's this thing, here's Doug with the British group that is developing this. And in Charleston, for instance, the hornwork at Marion Square. Well, today there's just one chunk that's left, that's ironed off. But with the app, and there's the chunk, there it is. You can now, we have the image, a digital image of what it would have looked like. So that then you can hold it up, because it's difficult to imagine when you're standing next to just a chunk of how massive this thing was. And so this extends, I mean, all across, across that whole area. And there would have been battlements and camps. And so we're trying to sort of bring people's imagination alive, so that when you see it, even though the physical landscape has changed drastically, you can still look back in time and see what it would have looked like, and understand the scale of some of these things. So that's exciting, and people, so often think that history is memorizing dates and names and all of this, and we're looking to sort of change that, and with getting people engaged and not just saying, oh, this is where the hornwork was, but hey, you pull out your phone, you can look at it and actually see what it would look like, and then hold your phone up and sort of scan around and see how it looks, and sort of envision this landscape as it was.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, George, for this
Thank
lovely
you.
presentation.